Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome, everyone, to our Commonwealth Club program. Proud of the fact that we have such a thing as the Commonwealth Club in our world, because we need a venue where all sides of a position and all points of view can have equal voice and be vetted and scrubbed and evaluated. And that's what the Commonwealth Club does for us. And today, being January 6th, it doesn't take much explanation to explain why we have Bart Gellman on as a guest, because to try to evaluate January 6th, not just in the rearview mirror, but what its implications have been going forward, and what today we are even thinking about its implications to be, is an endless topic and an important topic. So, well, Bart, I want to welcome you to the Commonwealth Club. It's a real honor to have you here. And of course, our viewing audience, who uh, tend to be way ahead of me in terms of explanations, are, I'm sure, aware of the several pieces that you've written for The Atlantic discussing January 6th as an event. Um, and one of them presciently predicting something like January 6th, um, less than peaceful transfer of power, and the other discussing what we've learned since January 6th about the future threats to democracy that this might involve. And that's really the theme of what we're talking about. We're not talking partisan politics, or we're not talking about who's right and who's wrong, or who's aggrieved and who shouldn't be. What we're talking about is whether our democracy as a system of government and as system of decision making for people can survive right now. And there are legitimate threats to that question. And that's more or less where I'd like to focus part our discussion today. Um, but let's start with the intuition that you had back in October of 2020 to to foresee that there was not going to be, for the first time in our history, unless you count 1877, there was not going to be a peaceful transition of power from the former executive to the recently elected executive. Where did that intuition come from?
Well, it started with a pretty simple proposition. It seemed obvious to me, and to lots of people, I think, that Donald Trump, under no circumstances, was going to concede the election if he lost. That he simply doesn't have it in him. It's not in his personality. It's not in his political strategy. He was going to insist that he had won no matter what and forever. And once you start with that proposition and ask yourself, what tools does he have available to him to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, to prevent the election from being decided against him? It turns out that it's very complicated, and there are a lot of possibilities. And I went through as many of them as I could think of. Uh, and fundamentally, his objective was always going to be to get the state legislatures in Republican controlled states that Biden won, and those were the essential swing states, uh, to appoint electors for Donald Trump, even though Biden had won the state election.
Let's drill down on that point. It's a little nerdy to start citing articles in the U.S. Constitution, but in this case, I think it's important that we understand that it's not a baseless notion from outer space to suggest that state legislatures could, on their own, choose how electors vote, which leads us to, unfortunately, the what we're calling these days the independent state legislature theory. Perhaps you could explain that, because it's such a fundamental part of the groundwork for the rest of our discussion today.
So you're right. Article 2 of the Constitution states that each state in the Union will appoint electors for president in the manner of the legislature's own choosing. They have complete autonomy on that. And in the days of the founders, American citizens did not vote directly for president. They voted for their state representatives, and the state representatives voted for president. It's been more than 150 years since every state transitioned to a popular vote choice. So what we're accustomed to now and what we think of as pretty fundamental to democracy is that you and I each get a vote for president, and our votes determine the appointment of electors in our state. The idea that Trump's people had was that the legislature in a state like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Arizona, all of which are Republican controlled and voted for Biden, could take back the power to appoint electors. Now, there's no doubt that a state legislature could pass a law stating that from now on in Wisconsin, the people don't get to vote anymore, and we in the legislature will choose our electors, beginning with the next election. It would not be a very popular thing to do. I don't think that any politician would think they could get away with it. But they have that power under the Constitution. It's much less clear whether they have the power, and actually more than less clear. It's highly dubious whether they have the power after an election takes place, after the popular votes have been cast to say, never mind, we're going to fire the voters. We are no longer interested in their opinion. We're going to appoint electors by our own lights. There are intermediate positions that you could take on that. And the independent state legislature doctrine states that the power of the legislature is plenary or unlimited and unbounded to appoint electors. And therefore, if, for example, county election authorities make any tiny change in the administration of elections that wasn't explicitly authorized by the state legislature, then the legislature can hold that the election did not proceed lawfully and then take back the power to appoint electors. It is a fringe theory, I would say. It's being pushed right now by lawyers affiliated with the Federalist Society. It is taking advantage of the strategic fact that 6 or 7 of the most important swing states in the country for presidential elections are governed by Republican state legislatures. And so if you give them the power, you are tipping the balance decisively in favor of the Republicans. There are 4 Supreme Court justices who have shown some sympathy with the independent state legislature doctrine in cases where it wasn't directly on point, but in dicta or in dissent, they've shown sympathy for the idea. And we don't know what Amy Coney Barrett thinks. She's never been called upon to opine. So it could be that it comes back to the Supreme Court and something shifts in that direction.
Yeah, just to add a footnote, the Justice Thomas feels that the doctrine is grounded in the 10th Amendment as opposed to any then in Article 2, which basically says that powers not expressly granted to the federal government and reserved to the state. So that would, if that were the applicable theory, that would give very wide sweep and credence to the right of the state legislature, whoever they are, whether they're Democratic or Republican, to just bypass the popular vote and legislate their own set of electors. So I just want to bore in on this because that was, at least by my take, and I want to cross-check this with you, one of the underlying theories that stimulated a group of people around Trump to feel as though there was a way to bypass what we'll call the Electoral Vote Count Act and to have Pence basically certify the election for Trump. Um, so, but that took um, it took a lot of people to be complicit. And I gather the complicity grew up around some of it was just they just want to stay in power and keep their job. But a lot of the support that was external to the uh, that day of certification 1 year ago today was um, the theory the election was stolen. And I'm curious, when we say the election was stolen or stop the steal or whatever phrase you want to use, what were the demographics of the people who actually found the motivation to go to the Capitol and, at least at the minimum, protest, and at the maximum sit in Nancy Pelosi's office with their feet up on the table?
Well, it's an interesting group, and you have to distinguish between what Trump supporters believe and what their elected leaders, the leaders of the Republican Party, believe. I'm quite convinced that if you were able to administer truth serum to Republican senators and members of Congress and governors and state legislators, the vast majority of them understand that Joe Biden won the last election. And they are either afraid to say so or opportunistically leaping upon the bandwagon of the stolen election in order to carry favor with the Trump electorate. But a great many, tens and tens of millions of Trump supporters uh, have been driven honestly to believe that the election was stolen. They are convinced by the floodgates of propaganda that have come out of their leadership and have come out of Fox News and One American News and the social networks that they're part of. I spent weeks and weeks in conversation with this one Trump supporter for my latest magazine piece when I was trying to plumb the roots of his belief on this. And it was unshakable, no matter how much evidence I brought to him, that his reasons were incorrect. So the people who came to the Capitol were, number one, true believers. They were not typical of the profile of politically violent people in the past. In U.S. history, including quite recent U.S. history, and actually around the world, according to experts who study this, political violence is committed largely by young men in their 20s, uh, disproportionately unemployed, low educated, uh, poor prospects in society. That is not at all what we saw on January 6th. What we saw was very much a middle class, uh, educated, employed. Mean age was 42 years old, which is wildly out of sync with history on this thing. And what it shows is that we have a politically violent mass movement in America now for the first time uh, since about 100 years ago with the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. You have tens of millions of Americans who are prepared to tell pollsters that violence is justified to restore Trump to power. Uh, that is a terrifying figure to me, and one that shows considerable degree of collapse of our governing institutions.
What about the where these people live? I don't. These people isn't a fair way to put it. The committed people who went to the Capitol that day, I, conventionally on a multiple choice test, I would have checked there from rural, predominantly red states. I gather that's actually the wrong answer.
It is the wrong answer, and it's fascinating. There's a group at the University of Chicago called CPOST that went through all the records and other public records and found the home county for each of the now more than 700 defendants in the capital cases. Uh, they are much more urban than rural. They are not likely to come from heavy Trump voting counties. They're likeliest to come from counties where the vote was very close, and they're frustrated. Many of them came from Biden counties where Biden had won by a small margin. Uh, and if you go through all the demographics and characteristics of the counties, they were interested. Maybe they come from counties where unemployment is high. No, not true. Uh, maybe they come from counties where education is low. No, not true. Uh, what they come from is counties where the proportion of the white non-Hispanic population is on the decline. I just say if there are fewer white people now in your county than there were 5 or 10 years ago, you are much more likely to have come from there and headed to the Capitol and taken part in the insurgency on January 6th. And that fits with polling data that shows that people who share the beliefs of the January 6th insurgents, and there are two key beliefs, uh, one being that Joe Biden stole the election, the other being that violence is justified to set that right. Uh, they also, by a supermajority, uh, believe that Black and Brown people are replacing white people in terms of position, power, and status in this country. They're believers. Pardon me, in a theory called the Great Replacement, which has been, for example, uh, pushed by Tucker Carlson on Fox News. The idea that in his version of it, that Democrats are deliberately trying to increase the number of so-called third world immigrants to this country to replace white voters and to change the nature of this country. Uh, of the of the 21 million people who agree with the January 6th insurgents, 2/3 of them believe in the Great Replacement. So there is a significant amount of racial resentment behind all this.
Let's assume that we are trying to formulate policies, we being the Democrats, the Republicans, the independents, policies that are going to bring some kind of a reconciliation of this polarized world that we live in, similar to the way, not to get too far from the topic, but the way Lincoln approached the end of the Civil War. It was not to put all of the Confederates in jail and make Robert E. Lee a criminal. It was to give them their horse and their gun and say, go home and let's form a new nation. Um, and in an optimal, perhaps naive view of what could be the best future, it would be some kind of a reconciliation like that. But how does the Democratic Party, because they're the only functioning party right now, at least from what I can see, how do they develop a political strategy that can embrace those people rather than saying, oh, you're stupid, you believe this, that's so obviously false. How can you think that? And basically shaming them. In other words, we have to find a policy that doesn't shame, but recalibrates how we look at our social responsibility to each other. I guess that's a question.
That that calls for an extraordinary kind of political leadership that I don't see immediately on the horizon. But I wonder about your analogy, and I'm making this up on the fly, so that's probably a mistake. But our situation now is not like the one in which North and South fought about whether slavery was good or bad or acceptable or necessary. It's almost as though right now we're fighting about whether slavery even existed. And you have half the country saying, "What slavery?" Because you have half the country, or not half, but 40%, uh, that says, despite all the evidence, uh, that Joe Biden lost the last election and believes fairy tales that are completely departing from the empirical world about what really happened with, Italian satellites and dead Venezuelan dictators changing votes and taking over election machinery and nonsense like that. If you have polarization on the basic foundations of knowledge, it's a very hard thing to see how to bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I agree with your um, polite qualification of my parallel, because the Confederacy did not deny Lincoln was elected. They just didn't like Lincoln's policies, and
That's
I
right.
agree, that's a different paradigm. Um, what I but what I'm addressing is, and maybe there isn't an answer to this, but we're not going to win back the health of democracy by making one side admit they were wrong and misled and stupid. We're going to win it back by having people realize that fundamentally, as a nation, we have to live with the fact that we have disagreements. And we have to live with the fact that some of the problems for democracy to solve, like economic inequality or the effects of globalization, so forth, are challenging. And neither side really has the answer to it. But that has to be a common goal, to use an agreed upon system of government. So what I worry about is if people are so embedded in the correctness of their position, people like you, or Anne Applebaum or George Packer or many of the other authors at the Atlantic can write very erudite articles describing the problem, but how many people's minds will you change by describing the problem?
Yeah, the political scientists who study this right now say that although there are significant differences in policy among Americans on the two sides, they are not as fundamentally split on policy questions, on what we should be doing. Uh, they are split affectively. That is to say, they hate each other. Uh, the the polarization of hatred is much stronger than the polarization of policy, to the point where uh, many people are convinced that only violence can solve the problem.
Of course, the question I would ask is, how does violence solve the problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, another civil war is not happening because we're not divided geographically. There's no North and South. As we just said, the the insurrectionists from January 6th came from cities, and they came from places where Biden won. They're living among us. If us is people who were not part of that, and uh, we there won't be a civil war, but there could be a lot of chaos.
it's always dangerous to quote facts that you read without cross-checking it, but I'll quote it anyway, that the more people in New York City voted for Trump than in North Dakota and South Dakota combined. So, that just goes to your point about geography. It's not as though, as with the for our Civil War, it was easy to draw a geographical line across somewhere between Maryland and New Jersey. But let's go back to the fact about ineluctable truth, because you know it it strikes me that if we can't overcome the existence of alternative realities, that we we can't stop hating each other, because we can't have a dialogue, because we're not even starting from the same factual premises. So when I'd like you to expand more on the individual that you referred to, that you tried to provide every factual premise you could and got nowhere. What do you have a sense that you could articulate as to what was in the way of his having an open mind to the possibility that maybe somewhat of you were saying might be partially true?
So this guy's a firefighter. He's the same age I am. He's a retired firefighter. Was a captain in the New York City Fire Department. He lives in the Bronx, where, by the way, the white population has declined by 2% since the last census. Uh, he's had a lot of objections over the years to affirmative action in the fire department and the arrival of minorities and women in the fire department force. And he showed up wearing his full dress uniform, which, by the way, he wasn't supposed to do, at a political event in favor of the January 6th defendants, Justice for January 6th. This what would have been a completely fringe group, which has now been embraced by many Republican elected officials, that says that the January 6th defendants are being oppressed and are patriots and need to be released. And he said he knew the election was stolen. I said, so if you're willing to work with me here, let's talk about how you know that. And he was open minded and it seemed, and certainly willing to go through the motions of it. He said, well, just for example, only 141 million people voted. And Donald Trump got 63 million votes. That doesn't leave enough votes for Biden to have won. That doesn't leave enough to get to Biden's alleged 74 million. There's 14 million missing voters here. That right away proves that something went badly wrong with the election. I said, how do you know that? He said, well, I don't know. My sister told me. And where did she get it? She got it. She doesn't remember where she got it. Actually, I had him go and check. But I tracked it down that those figures originated in an obscure right wing website, and they just mixed up the numbers. It's imaginable that it was a careless error and not deliberate, but since it was immediately corrected by lots of people and continued to be said, it doesn't look like it was an honest error. They were comparing apples and oranges, and the number of people who voted was much more than 141 million. The official counts, there were actually more than enough votes to account for Biden and Trump, because there were a number of spoiled ballots and there were third-party ballots and so forth. In other words, there's nothing to this. You could show, look, they took this figure from the wrong column. Here's the original source. Here's the page number. Take a look. That made no impression on him. He said, Well, I can't get into all the facts and figures, but that's what I heard. And anyway, there's so much more proof that the election was stolen. So he told me that the violence on January 6th was caused by a combination of Antifa and, weirdly, U.S. Special Forces, who were coming in there under the guidance of Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. By the way, somehow they were in cahoots to get special forces to come in and commit violence. And I said, that sounds wild. Where'd that come from? And he said, you got to go look up a general named so and so on Rumble, the right wing YouTube site. And so I find the general on Rumble, and he does say this. And so I called him up. I called the general. He's a retired general. He's been out of the Air Force for 30 years. He's well into his 80s. And I say to him, how do you know there were special forces there? And he said, well, they looked like special forces. He had a witness who was on the scene who saw guys, presumably with short haircuts and looking physically fit, and decided they must be special forces. How do you know it's Antifa? He said his witness told him that one of these young men said, we're playing Antifa today. He said that they'd stolen Nancy Pelosi's laptop. How do you know that? Well, they had something square looking under their coat. Well, how do you even know it's a computer, let alone that it was Nancy Pelosi's? In other words, he didn't even pretend to have evidence for his speculations. And not only that, but his son called me up afterward and said, in as many words, my dad's lost a few steps. He's getting old. He's starting to say things that don't make any sense to me, and we wish you wouldn't interview him anymore. I tell all this to the firefighter, and he just doesn't believe it. I mean, he heard an authority. He sounded good on the tape, and there's motivated reasoning, right? I mean, this is a guy who wanted Trump to win, and everybody he knows wanted Trump to win. And when he gets on social media, he's surrounded only by people who want Trump to win. It's actually begins to become inconceivable that there are any large number of people in the world who don't want Trump to win. And that whole self-reinforcing media ecosystem makes him, as far as I can tell, unreachable.
And it's huge. I mean, the self-reinforcing ecosystem. I mean, I live in one myself. On different policy issues, but I tend to watch the same television stations and read the same newspapers and read the same magazine articles as my friends, and we call each other and talk about them. And it seems that one of our fundamental structural problems is we have created two nations with separate self-reinforcing ecosystems. My gratuitous take on the way it looks to me. So let's talk again. The basic theme here is the challenge to our democracy and its ability to preserve to me, what is a fundamental quality of democracy is the use of elections to choose your representatives and public confidence that those representatives have been fairly and honestly selected. So what steps has the Republican Party been taking, starting before January 6th in a sense, but mostly after January 6th of 2022, make it so that perhaps the person with the fewer votes can actually win? What are some of the right in front of our face steps that are being taken?
Well, the first step is a very consistent and powerful and charismatic and demagogic message being transmitted and reinforced that you cannot trust the institutions of the election to call balls and strikes. That the norms we've always valued in this country, that we cast our ballots and they're counted cleanly with vanishingly few exceptions. That's all thrown away. And if you undermine public confidence in the election apparatus, then that's job one. And Trump stated many times before the election that the only way he could lose would be if Biden cheated. That there was no possibility he could lose in a fair election. Uh, what's happened is that Republican operatives around the country have now studied carefully what worked and what didn't work when Trump tried to overthrow a free and fair election last time. And they found all the obstacles that got in Trump's way, and they are systematically going about uprooting those obstacles. And so when you have county clerks or secretaries of state in the different states, or election commissions, election authorities who certified the Biden vote and refused pressure from Trump to change that, those people are being hounded out of office. They're subjected to massive numbers of death threats. If they're in elected positions, then Trump and his people are primarying them and trying to make sure that they won't be elected again. And if they can't do any of those things, they're changing the law so that those people no longer have the power to certify elections. Let's take an example in Georgia where they're doing all of the above. Brad Raffensperger is Secretary of State. Uh, uh, Famously, and it became public with the recording, Trump called him up and tried to get him to change the result. They counted 3 times in Georgia. And after they counted 3 times and found that Biden won, Trump called up Raffensperger and demanded that he find more votes for Trump and change the result. And Raffensperger refused. What's happened since then? Trump has endorsed someone to run against Raffensperger in the coming election. And meanwhile, the Republican state legislature has turned against Raffensperger, who is a lifelong Republican. And they have changed the law so that he, the Secretary of State, no longer has the power to certify elections in the state of Georgia. They've also changed the law so that they, the legislature, controlled by Republicans, can fire the county supervisor of elections in any county in the state of Georgia and substitute an administrator of their choice if they believe that the county supervisor is not doing a good job. And what county were they talking about when they debated this bill? They were talking about Fulton County, which is Atlanta, which is the Democratic stronghold in the state of Georgia. And so they're trying to bust him out of office by electing someone else. And the someone else is running explicitly on a platform that Georgia should not have certified its election for Biden, that the election should have been overturned. This is an extraordinary thing for even one person to do. And there are, by a recent count in the Washington Post, I think it was 163 people running for election related offices around the country right now who are running explicitly on the platform of the big lie that Trump really won. And if you're running to be in charge of counting votes and you're announcing that you would have counted the votes for Trump when they really went to Biden, something is really wrong with this picture.
Or else you have you're counting on the alternative reality that we talked about before, that will in fact get you votes if you're willing to rectify the crime of a stolen election in 2020.
Right. It is a vote getting strategy that is likely to work very well with Republican primary electorates. It is a catastrophic fact that 2/3 of all Republicans believe the election was stolen. The more politically active they are, the more likely they are to believe that. And this is why so many elected politicians are afraid to admit that Biden won the election. They will be punished. They will be punished electorally, and they worry about their families because if you are put in the crosshairs of Trump or of Fox News opinion hosts, you can expect uh, a large number of threats in person, on the phone, by email to you and your family.
Yeah. There's no upside to it. I mean, it's not like you gain something by taking that position. It's just all downside. Um, there was another situation that I remember at the time involving the Michigan certification board where there were 4 people on it. And t- tell us about that, because that shows how down into the grassroots this movement goes.
So, in the state of Michigan, each county has a four-person commission that uh, accepts the reports from all the precincts and gets columns of figures and votes and says everything looks to be in order, and we're hereby certifying it's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and these things have traditionally operated on a bipartisan basis. And then there's a statewide version of the same thing. And Trump uh, was just barely too late to stop the certification of the vote around Detroit. The county commission Republicans voted to certify the election, and then they got a call from Trump. And then after this strong arming by the president, they tried to change their vote and retract their certification. Now it turns out that in Michigan law, there's no such thing as retracting your certification, and so that didn't work for them. Trump then went to the statewide board, where there were 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And one Republican was willing to go along and say he would refuse to certify the election. So it all came down to the shoulders of a guy whose name I think is Vandeveld, Aaron Vandeveld. And he looked at the facts and the figures and the circumstances and said, there's nothing here to raise any doubt about the outcome. The people of Michigan have voted for Biden for president. And he certified. And then he went into hiding. And since then, he's been hounded out of office and replaced by a more reliable Republican who will be available next time to put sand in the machinery. And this is happening all around the country. Democrats are not paying as much attention to the local election machinery, and the Republicans are paying a great deal of attention to it at every level, from sort of the local election supervisor, which is even sometimes a voluntary job, all the way up to Secretary of State and Attorney General in these states.
Yeah, I'd like to go to that point, because when I watch, I sense a tremendous sense of non-urgency in the Democratic Party. Now, I have to concede that my information always comes through media or print or so forth. So I'm not sitting in the halls of Congress. But Biden, back in July, I believe it was, made a speech about how election integrity is the core of democracy, and it's one of the most important um, matters that his government, including the Attorney General's office, can be addressing. But then I haven't seen much happen other than we're now trying to figure out how to get Joe Manchin to change the filibuster rule.
Yeah, you're right about Biden's speech. He went to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and he stood under this great big reproduction of the preamble, we the people, in that fancy script. And he said something even stronger. He said that the efforts by unnamed persons, because he's unwilling to say Trump or Republican in this context, but he said the efforts to subvert election machinery is the gravest threat to our democracy since the Civil War. That is an extraordinarily big thing for a president of the United States to say. And you would expect that if a president sees the gravest threat to democracy since the Civil War, he's going to be marshaling his powers of persuasion and otherwise behind an effort to meet that threat. And that's what we haven't seen from Biden. He is recently, as the January 6th anniversary came upon us, been talking more about it and talked again about it today. And he's speaking in very firm tones. And it may be that he's now prepared to give this as high a priority as he's given to the infrastructure bill or the Build Back Better Act and so forth. And it's true that he's had a difficult hand to play because federal legislation is part of the answer. And Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are not willing to change the filibuster rules so far. And there's not one Republican vote for those voting rights bills that would address part of the problem. But I think any president of the United States knows what his powers are. He knows what he can do. He has the ability to give his time and effort and energy and the resources of the presidency to a problem. If he's prepared to treat this as the national emergency that I think it is, then we'll be seeing evidence of that in the months to come.
Because without, I mean, we have two elections coming up, and we should differentiate that 2022 is going to be important for who controls the House and the Senate. And then 2024, of course, is for the presidency. But if he cannot get a voting rights bill through that at least creates the philosophy of one person, one vote, and fair representation, and a lot of the phrases we like to talk about when we praise our system of government. On the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bills and all those things don't matter. They're gone. They're toast because a Republican controlled executive and or legislative are going to cancel it. So I don't understand the triaging, I guess. I don't know why the voting rights bill isn't by some exponential factor the highest priority for the executive branch right now.
Yeah, look, presidents can never do just one thing. And fixing the economy, addressing COVID, absolutely huge, huge responsibilities of the president, and he could not have ignored. And they took huge efforts to make progress on. But I do believe he needs to give comparable degree of effort and first priority going forward to this the creation of the machinery of election theft by a significant fraction of the Republican Party, and to the growth of a mass political movement that is tolerant of violence in this country, which is a cancer. And if he's not addressing those things, then the risks that our democracy unravels are meaningful. I mean, one thing when you distinguish between the 2022 election and the 2024, the control of Congress will make an enormous difference potentially in the outcome of the presidential election 2 years later. When Trump was trying to overthrow the vote, when he was trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power to the victor of the election, he targeted at the end the reason why January 6th is a big anniversary for us. He targeted the electoral vote count in Congress. That was the final stage in certifying the election before inauguration. He was limited in his options because Republicans did not control both houses of Congress. Uh, if Republicans take control of both houses of Congress, uh, then they will have control over how the vote is counted. He tried to get Mike Pence to do something he had no legal authority to do any of several things that he had no legal authority to do because he didn't have the House and the Senate in his hands. But if Republicans control which electors to recognize, then they can control the outcome of the election.
And that's our Electoral Vote Count Act that defies, and the 12th Amendment that defy reading by normal people. But there's another element there too as well, and that is the way an election where nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes gets decided. It goes to the House and each state gets one vote, and the Republicans control the House in terms of number of states, so that you would elect a Republican president under the system of neither candidate getting 270 votes.
That was one of the several strategies that Trump's legal brain trust came up with for Mike Pence a year ago today, that he would simply reject the electoral slate from several states, claiming that they were fraudulent slates that were chosen by a flawed process, send the votes back to the states, which there's no such thing as under the Constitution, but that's what they wanted him to do. And then neither party would have received 270 votes. At that point, according to the 12th Amendment, as you say, the election goes to the House of Representatives, and the House votes by state delegation. And even though the Democrats controlled the House, Republicans controlled 26 of the 50 state delegations there because of the way the arithmetic worked out. And so they would have presumably voted for Trump, notwithstanding the Electoral College voting for Biden. That was one of the strategies that Pence refused to carry out.
And it's another reason why 2022 matters. And one of the observations we're forced to make about democracy is how much of it we have, it relies on custom and courtesy, and there are not precise rules like you find in the Internal Revenue Code about how elections are held or what happens. So, for example, let's suppose Pence had chosen to follow Trump's advice and refused to certify the election. It is a rhetorical question, but who could have done something about that? But somebody would have, and it would have probably eventually gotten worked out. But there's nothing that covers that, right? Because we never conceive, in the way the Constitution and the Electoral Count Vote Act is written, that could happen.
There are people who've tried to game out every one of those scenarios, and they're all a huge mess. So under one scenario, I mean, if Pence had tried to do that and said the election now goes to the House, Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, would have said, no, it doesn't. And she controls the procedures of the House and controls the floor, and would have been able to thwart that in all likelihood up to a certain point. And if no president was selected and certified by Congress, then the person who would be the acting president of the United States would be Nancy Pelosi. And so there was that scenario among many that went through this.
Yeah, but that's the point. That we found out in the last 4 years how much of our government functions on a rule of social courtesy and respect for the boundaries of the Congress vis-a-vis the executive and the judiciary vis-a-vis the Congress and so forth. And a lot of it is unwritten. It's just custom. And all of a sudden, what we viewed as accepted procedure, we found out is you can choose not to follow it. Nobody can do much about it.
Well, I mean, by definition, norms define normal behavior, and Trump is a deeply abnormal figure in our politics, and rejected the norms. And we found out that uh, we we didn't have one referee who could say the game's over, go home, you lost.
That's the point. Yeah, there's nobody in charge. Ultimately, the Supreme Court isn't in charge. They they would characterize much of this as political questions, and so it's a it's a structural defect in our governmental system that we're not going to fix right now. But I do want to talk about how we fix the bigger problem of trying to work towards a single set of facts. And it's kind of bringing the responsibility back to you and others in your profession as to the role of journalism in essentially the protection of truth and the protection of our democratic system of government.
It's a job that I'm not sure I know how to do. I've grown up in journalism with the faith that I could write for people on the fence, who that there were enough people who wanted to know the facts, and that if I showed my work, I displayed my evidence, I did my best to tell the truth, I explained how and why I had uh, uncovered certain facts, that I could reach people, and that there would be a critical mass of people who would respond to that. And I'm imperfect and can get things wrong, and somebody might prefer another journalist or another news organization or another account. But in the marketplace of ideas, if you laid all these things out there, uh, that society would find its way, uh, and there would always be dissidents and people who disagreed. But facts are facts, and I don't have that faith anymore, and I don't know what to do about it. I write for the Atlantic, and it is very important to the mission of the Atlantic since the 19th century that we be of no party or clique, that we're not on one side or the other, that we're telling it as straight as we can. But I know that uh, those Trump voters are not, by and large, reading the Atlantic, and I don't know how to reach them.
Right. And which brings us into a kind of the irons, as they call it in sailing, where you can't get any movement because Congress cannot talk, congressional cannot talk to each other. The Supreme Court has its limited view of its role in um, deciding how our society functions. And the only, and social media is not the answer because that's balkanized. So really the only answer I can come up with is legitimate journalism. In other words, journalism that is trying to do what you described, which is okay, here are the facts, and here's some counterfacts, perhaps, because there's not always unanimity, but we can all stimulate the earth is round and not flat. And let's start from that premise and work our way into this discussion. So I'm wondering whether we have to uh, rethink the degree of, um, I don't like the term aggressiveness, but e- energy that we use our journalistic skills to try to bring some narrative into the common marketplace of ideas and see if we can change things. Because if we can't, I don't see how we get out of this mess.
Well, I have changed my approach to some things. I grew up in journalism, uh, believing that you have to show all sides, that you have to keep perspective and opinion out of a straight news story, uh, and so on. And I never in my life wrote things the way I've written them in the past 16 months. Uh, but the Trump years have showed us that we do have to take sides to one degree. That is to say, as journalists, we're allowed to be on one side when it comes to the truth. We're allowed to be on the side of the truth. Uh, and we're allowed to call a lie a lie. And journalists have become much more aggressive about that in an era when Trump told 10,000 documented lies during his presidency and is incapable of being shamed about it. And he's got a superpower that way. I mean, he's remarkably good at it. He's good at it in a way that I haven't seen any other politician able to duplicate. I mean, anybody would like to be able to get away with anything and never apologize, never explain, move on to the next subject. But nobody's pulled it off the way he had. And so it becomes the responsibility of journalists to identify a lie. And we're also allowed to be on the side of democracy. We're allowed to be on the side of the people get to vote and get to make a choice, and no one gets to overturn their vote. That's a value that we're allowed to stand behind, and that's what the journalism I've been doing in the Atlantic for the past year and a half has been pro-democratic in the small d democratic sense, and I've been warning quite sharply that we're in trouble and need to do something about it.
Yeah. I think we, most of us agree that we are willing to accept losing an election. It's just that we don't want the election to be predetermined by a system that has basically, it's like, you know, tipping up, paying the referees off in a basketball game or something.
If I could just say, you've reminded me. I mean that there in public opinion polling, there is paradoxically a split between red and blue, in which uh, Republicans, Trump voters, believe that there is a significant, grave threat to our democracy because they believe the election was stolen. Uh, Democrats right now are not especially exercised about it. Much smaller numbers of Democrats believe there's an existential threat to our democracy, when exactly the reverse is the case. And in fact, the belief of the Republicans that the election was stolen is itself one of the gravest threats to our democracy.
Yeah, because it energizes the grassroots. And I don't sense what is energizing grassroots on what we'll call the democratic slash independent side of the equation, other than arguing about, you know, what should be in Build Back Better or what shouldn't be in there and issues like that. Um, and without that energy, it's not a fair fight. I have one more point, Bart, that I want to get to, and that is the outcome of the January 6th commission. How do you see that playing out? I don't mean what their report is. I mean the the impact that their report will have on public opinion.
Well, there are a few things to say about it. First of all, we can be certain that the commission will, or the committee will report not later than November of this year, because they are aware they're aware that their life as a committee is at risk in the next election. That if the Republicans take control of the House, that the committee will simply be disbanded, and if the report is at the printer waiting for the machines to start, the machines will not start. So they will report. before Congress can change hands. Uh, Republicans and Trump are doing their best to delegitimate the committee. They are going to say it's all a struggle for political advantage. And I think uh, there is something to say that's in common between the committee and journalism, which is that startling facts have a power of their own. The committee is already showing signs of discovering important evidence about the overall plot to overthrow the election, not just exactly what happened inside the Capitol on January 6th, but what led up to it and how that fit into a larger plan to overthrow the election. Uh, and yes, that pre-existed January 6th. And subpoena power is a marvelous thing. I've often wished for it as a journalist. They are, even in the course of not fully cooperating with the committee, the former chief of staff Meadows has handed over 6,000 or 7,000 pages of documents. That's an extraordinary cache of material, and they're finding out things that nobody knows, and they will be able to tell a quite compelling tale. What they're doing could equally be done by the Justice Department in the context of a criminal investigation. As far as we know, that's not happening. We don't know for sure because it's possible the Justice Department has grand juries working in secret and unannounced investigations, but it's harder and harder to believe that there is a major Justice Department investigation into the effort to overthrow the election because you would expect, if there were, that it would collide with the January 6th committee, and that there would be times when there would be questions about whether, for example, to immunize a witness for the committee when the Justice Department might not want them immunized because they want them prosecuted down the road, or there could be struggles to control certain kinds of. Yeah, exactly. So the committee can make recommendations for criminal prosecution, but honestly, Merrick Garland doesn't need the committee or anyone else to tell him what's out there. If he's not going after it, he's not going after it.
Yeah. Well, I hope that we can hope, and that's, I guess, the most we can wish for. But I want to thank you and congratulate you and the Atlantic for devoting as much effort and careful thought as you do into these problems. They're not partisan problems. The issue of a functioning democracy affects both sides. I'm going to suggest autocracy does not, in the long run, benefit anyone, and that could be the net outcome of a declination of our democracy. So what you're doing is important, and I want to thank you for spending this time with us, and keep on writing.
Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation.
Appreciate it, Mark, very much. And thank you to the audience. Yeah. And with that, the Commonwealth Club is virtually adjourned.